down at, let me get on down here, here we go. So there's church fellowship, new relations with new people. The exciting thing is you meet people with new needs. Sister Dorothy went into the hospital and she had congestive heart failure. It's some serious business as far as what can go with a 75-year-old lady. And she says, when you're done with the worship service, would you please bring me communion? And so we had a communion service with her. One of the guys, he's all excited. He talked to us last time I was down there just dropping off a communion service set, and he said, would you come over to my room? I want to show you what I've got. And he's put together kind of a creation diorama, just a small thing, probably this long, this high. He's got a globe of the earth, and he's got the 10 Commandments, and he's got a little tiny hand-carved Noah's Ark there, and he goes through the different stages up through the second coming of Christ. And so he's got the whole story in a diorama he wanted to share with us in his room. And the other guy, that's the younger guy that does drive, and he was kind of in a walker, kind of bummed up. But he said, I got my grandpa's books, and he had 3 books that his grandpa had written. One was on missions, and the man was a missionary in Pakistan. And so this young guy was all excited. He says, I don't know if you're going to have a chance to read these, but here's 3 books. I'll thumb through them. I'll just enjoy them and read a little bit through and whatever. But one's on missions and some are Bible systematic theology and all the other. But it's kind of interesting. I wanted to leave our study on the book of Judges in a good way, because, Charles Dickens talked about it was the best of times. He talked about it being the age of wisdom. He talked about the season of light. He talked about it was a spring of hope. He talked about everything was before us. He talked about we were all going directly to heaven. That was the brighter part. Of course, he talked about the worst of times and the age of foolishness and the season of incredulity and the winter of despair. And we were all going the other way. But Ruth is a story that came to be, was written during the book of Judges, during this time of despair, during this time of servitude, slavery, high taxation, brutality, beatings, theft and looting. There was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own sight. We didn't spend a lot of time on Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar, did we? But somewhere between Othniel and Ehud, Ruth came. This was the time of the Moabite oppression, when the Moabites controlled the land. And we wondered about Israel's testimony because they kept on doing something dumb, and that's kind of called marrying out of the faith. They always married the neighbor boy. They never married who they should marry. They always married somebody else. Samson always seemed to end up, and his parents rebuked it. Is there not an Israelite, Hebrew girl, beautiful enough for you? Yeah, but I want that girl from Timnah. I want that girl from so-and-so. Get her for me. I want her to wife. And here we have the story of Ruth. And it starts a little bit dark. And we're going to read in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. It seemed like every time there was a famine in Israel, they went down to Egypt, or they went down to Moab. They always left Dodge and tried to find, because Egypt has always been known as the breadbasket of the world, but in this case, Moab ended up being the breadbasket of the world. And Moab was a land of opportunity. You know why Moab was a land of opportunity? Because they stole all their produce from Israel. So while Israel was starving, they were eating well. And if you were from Moab, and apparently Ruth's sons married Moabite women. And as long as you had Moabite wives, your father-in-law would make sure you ate well, and they were well provided. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of the two sons are Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now it's kind of interesting in our Bible geography. What do we know about, oh, little town of Bethlehem? Who was born there? Jesus, thousands of years later. Now I wonder, is there any connection between oh, little town of Bethlehem in the days of Ruth and oh, little town of Bethlehem in the days of Jesus Christ? Yes. Same town, house of bread. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Now this is tough, but this is good. The woman's a widow woman. But the good news is she had two sons. She didn't have two daughters, she had two sons. In this day and age, if you didn't have men around to provide, you went hungry. It was tough for a woman. Remember the old woman, the widow, as her son died, and the prophet had raised him from the dead, and he's the one that produced the miracle of the cruse of oil and the wheat and the grain, that as long as she kept pouring, during the time of famine. And God provided. And then the son dies, and all of a sudden she panics, if you remember that story in the Old Testament. You give me my son just to take him away? She was bitter. But now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and she was left with her two sons, and they married Moabite women. Swell. Stupid. Smart. Just depends on who you look at, how you look at it. Because one of these Moabite women was Ruth. Normally this would be, you're marrying a heathen woman. You're marrying a pagan. Or back in our days, Mom was Catholic, Dad was Lutheran, they raised us up Methodist. Mom ended up not marrying within the church, and so back in those days, if a Catholic married a non-Catholic, either you promised to raise your kids up Catholic, and the priests go along with it, or you were just anathema from the church. And you don't think things were tougher among the Jewish people? You're a Jew and you marry a Moabite pagan? That's like your daughter comes home and says, well, I found this Arab, is Muslim, or I found this Russian Orthodox, or even Donald Trump. His daughter married a Jewish man. And in some circles 50 years ago, you just didn't, as a Protestant, marry a Jew. And 50 years ago, as a Catholic, you married a Catholic. But here, she had her daughters marry Moabites, one named Orpah, and the other Ruth. Now we can park on this name Orpah. Guess who on TV got named after Orpah? You're right. Oprah Winfrey. And she got her name from Ruth's sister.
But they misspelled it.
Or sister-in-law. And yeah, they misspelled it, but hey, what's a little bit of spelling? But you've got Oprah Winfrey in the book of Ruth on top of Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So look at this particular time. I mean, it was a time of darkness. You have a woman that's now a widow. Now she ends up bearing her sons. This is a hard time. I remember I was in the monument business for 25 years, and I went up to a little cemetery up, you've heard of Yeehaw Junction?
Yeah.
All right. Yeehaw Junction is boondocks.
Boondock.
20 miles, 15, 20 miles north of Yeehaw Junction is a little town called Kenansville. How many ever heard of Kenansville?
Probably.
You've heard it today. And in that Kenansville is a little Baptist church, a little Baptist cemetery, and I was doing a headstone for this woman. Her son was high school, prom, coming home from prom, car accident, not injured, killed. 10, 12 years prior, we had buried another son in that Kenansville cemetery. We had done a headstone for that son. And now 10, 12, 15 years go by, and now she's burying her last son in the grave. And you as a mother burying your two children in a grave, you plan your children or grandchildren outlive us and to carry on the legacy. And here, all the hurt, all the tears coming down this woman's cheek. And now I can relate to Ruth, not Ruth, but Naomi, not only burying a husband and become a widow woman, but now burying her two sons. And you who have buried children prior can really feel and know the darkness that she went through. We call these the difficult days. But remember, this is still going to be a love story. I'm going to tell you a little bit of the end before I go to the beginning. It all comes out all right. When we talk about a love story, it's a positive love story. One of these love stories I'm going to tell you about is Ole and Bess. We're in Wisconsin. Ole was 23 years of age. The year, 1900. He opened a pattern making shop, and in his spare time he built his own horseless carriages. He road tested these things in town, and much to his astonishment and dismay, his fellow Milwaukeeans kind of question about Ole's newfound horseless buggies. But soon Ole won some fame. He was an engineer and eccentric, and he found success elusive. He was a manager of a modest office, and there was this young neighbor by the name of Bess Carey, who he fell in love with. And in 1906, Ole and Bess were engaged. And during a picnic on an island that summer, Ole made a 5-mile round trip by rowboat in 90-degree weather to fetch his beloved some ice cream. Though he was a powerful man and far from lazy, Ole realized en route that an automobile was not the only vehicle that could benefit from a gasoline engine. Trying to impress his sweetheart. So, Carrie and Ole were married in the year 1906. In 1907, Ole Evinrude founded Evinrude Motors in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The firm immediately developed a one-cylinder 1.5 horsepower model, which became an instant success upon its introduction in the year 1909. And that summer, the first field test of Evinrude's outboard motor, a 60-pound iron engine that his new wife said looked like a coffee grinder. Despite this initial skeptic, Bess became Evinrude's ad and executive over the next 2 years. Thanks to Mr. Evinrude's refinements and Mrs. Evinrude's publicity, don't row, throw the oars away. And there's Miss Beth advertising that boat motor as she was licking on a melted ice cream cone that just sizzled in the soaring heat in a 5-mile rowboat ride to fetch her ice cream. A love story indeed. But we're back to Bethlehem, Judah, and this love story. The Bible says when she heard in verse 6 in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people, by providing food for them. Naomi and her daughter-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi, in verse 8, said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. And they said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up to become fathers? Would you remain unmarried until then, for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again, and then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and went back to Moab and opened up her TV broadcast station. No, she went back. But Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods." You notice this? My God's not treating me well. My God has taken away my husband. My God has taken away my sons. All I've got is bitterness. I have no hope. I have no future. I have no children for you to marry in the future. Go home. Go back to your gods. Go back to your family. You don't have any family in me. Goodbye. So long. Farewell. Bum, 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 bum. Goodbye. My Coney Island baby. But Ruth replied, "I only do that because we got a barber shopper in the congregation. You have to pardon me." Dad sang barber shop, Long Island, New York, Coney Island. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go." Verse 16. "And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will become my people, and your God, my God." Now this is a conversion. This is where Ruth says, I'm going to leave pagan gods behind. I'm going to cleave to Lord God Jehovah. Your God will become my God. She made a life-changing decision here. In spite of darkness, in spite of bleak, in spite of everything voting against you. You're up to play ball, and you got 3 strikes. You already got 3 strikes against you before you ever get to bat. That's where her life was. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried, next to my mother-in-law. You talk about loyalty. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And so the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem, a little town of Bethlehem, and arrived at Bethlehem, and the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" They hadn't seen her for 10 years, remember? This was a long parting. And they finally came together. Now this is a little story behind the story. Remember the 2 sons-in-law, Mahlon, Chilion, are the 2 sons? Mahlon's name actually meant sickly and sickness. Now I don't know if he's a weak man and kind of a frail man. Chilion meant pining and wasting. Their names actually were their actually physical condition they were in. I hate to have a nickname pasty, or a nickname anemic, or a nickname palsy, or a nickname polio, or a nickname wasting away, but these guys, what's your name? My nickname's, well, it was Dick, Richard. His name was Sick. It wasn't Dick, it was Sick. And what's your name? My name is pining. And all the death that was there, and all the somberness, and all the sadness. John 1 John 3:18 says, "My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth." And I love that in Ruth 1, verse 15 through 17. I'm willing to go the whole run, the whole route with you. Well, in chapter 2, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing, whose name was Boaz. Apparently he might have been on the council, because he says he's a man of standing. Landowner, farmer. He had a lot of tractors in the tractor barn. He had some harvesting equipment. I don't know what he had, but the man was well heeled. He was not poor. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go over to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And it was the Hebrew custom that the Israelites that were farmers were not to clear off everything, but they were to leave the outer ridges for the poor and the strangers to come in and harvest. They were always supposed to keep a little bit aside. But mind you, the grain was there, but the people had to go out and gather it. It wasn't gathered for them and distributed. If you want it, you want to feed your family, get out and gather the gleanings. Now some said, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. And as it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was the field of Elimelech. And just then Boaz arose from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they all called back. You see the relationship between labor. "The Lord bless you. God give you a great day, my workers. God bless you too, farmer, owner, landlord. May the Lord smile upon you." Good relation. You notice the boss-employee relationship. Nowadays, the attitude, how little can I do to keep from getting fired, and how little can I pay to keep these people from quitting? The former replied, Boaz said unto the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" And the foreman replied, "She's a Moabitess, who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." And she went into the field and was worked steadily from morning until now, except for the short rest in the shelter. And Boaz protects Ruth. So Boaz said to Ruth, "Daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So not only can you glean, my workers will give you protection. Nobody will bully you, and no man will try to take advantage of you. You're under my protection, so you're safe. Not only that, when you're thirsty, don't even worry about bringing your own canteen along. Help yourself to the big water jugs there that are for the field hands. And apparently, he thought she was good looking too. He had an eye on that Moabitess girl. She was sharp looking, and he was single. And Boaz replied, "I have been told all what you've done for your mother-in-law. I've been told what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband." Apparently reputation precedes them. And apparently her leaving her nation and staying faithful to her mother-in-law did gain her brownie points. It did gain her not only favor with Ruth's mother Naomi, but it gained favor in the village. "We know how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord." And she said, "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." And then Boaz said, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. And when he sat down, he said to the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. And she got up to glean, and Boaz gave orders to his men, even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her. You talk about favor. When she came home, she didn't come with a little old saucepan full. She came home with a bushel basket full of grain. And the mother says, I thought you'd only bring enough to make a few loaves of bread. You're coming with a whole bushel. What have you been doing? Oh, God's been good, Mama. God's been good. They found out that in this story of Ruth, that, of course, Naomi said, call me Mara, call me bitter. God's been so. But this is the love story about what happens. Now Ruth, they're obligated. If you become widowed, remember how Jesus said, well, if you've got a wife and the brother dies, who marries her? Well, the next brother. What if he dies? Well, the next brother marries. What if he dies? Well, the next brother marries her. What if he dies? The next brother. Up to 7 times, remember? Florida law of marriage and divorce. You can be married 7 times in Florida.
In Florida?
In Florida. Yeah. And where do they get it from? Jesus in the New Testament says, how many times to remarry the brother? Up to 7 brothers. That's where we get, this is where biblical law in precedent affects English law, and how English law affected American law, how American law affected Florida law. Of course, those people don't always recognize the Bible, nor Lord God Almighty, the lawgiver, but this is where it all comes from, the Bible. Now, Boaz was not next in line. There was somebody in line before him. And he says, hey, you know that scruffy lady that came in from Moab the other day? Yeah. You know that woman that came from pagan background that worshipped, her family worships a bunch of pagan gods back in Moab. I'm sure he kind of painted a picture of, you know, that she's the prettiest thing, and she's so spiritual, and she's a good cook, and she's a hard worker. I don't think he played that up a little bit. He says, this scruffy gal that dragged in with Naomi the other day, yeah, what about her? You're obligated to marry her. Not me, man. Yes. No way. I'm not marrying that old heathen riffraff that came dragging in from Moab, from the other side of the tracks. She's trailer park trash. You can hear it now. So the guy had to give him his shoe. You know how the Arabs throw a shoe if they showed you? But in the Jewish days, if we hand you a shoe, it's like a bill of sale. It's an agreement. And so Ruth lay at his feet and claimed him the obligation of brother to marry. And since the one accepted the shoe and turned down his obligation, the other guy that was so much in love with Ruth, he's the one that ended up marrying the girl. Well, it says, I've told you all about you have done for your mother. This is kind of the story right in here. You've got the book of Luke, then you've got Elimelech, and in here you have Moab, which represents the land of sin and death. Elimelech dies, Mahlon marries Ruth, Chilion marries Orpah. Mahlon and Chilion die, Orpah turns back, Ruth comes to Israel. And here you have a nameless kinsman that comes along, and he turns down the marriage relationship. Boaz, he ends up marrying her, and Ruth and her family are redeemed by Boaz. We have the marriage of Boaz and Ruth, and later on we've got Obed, and you have the coming of joy. You have the response of faith. You've got united with the strong one. You've got the son born and the hope for mankind. And this is the rest of the story, the family tree. Now, if you look at my family tree, Morgan, you're going to find some nuts up in that family tree. Some people say, their family tree is kind of like granola, it's full of nuts and flakes. But here's a good family tree. This is the kind of family tree we ought to be proud of. And that's Ruth 4:21-22. Let's turn our Bible on this particular one. Ruth chapter 4, 21 and 22. The Bible says, "This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Simon. Simon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. Jesse the father of..." Who?
David.
"And David the father of..."
Jesus.
Jesus Christ. Now, in the midst of all this darkness, despair, and bitterness, there's that one ember of hope that was fanned, and that hope kept hope alive. And that hope was Jesus Christ to bring salvation. King David brought order to the kingdom. He brought order among the broken nations and all the division, diversity, and all the blackness. Remember, the Bible kept saying there's no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in their own sight. Once they had a king in Israel, Saul, David. King David was the unifier. Solomon was the one that built the temple. But David was the one that paved the way to bring unity and a united kingdom and to bring a climate for the coming of Jesus Christ the Messiah. And with Jesus Christ the Messiah came salvation. And that is the real love story. Say that Bible verse with me, John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." That is the ultimate love story. Thank you for listening, Brother Glenn.